Hollow Creek was a small, forgotten town, nestled deep in the woods, isolated from the rest of the world. The few who remained there clung to their traditions, including a superstition passed down for generations: never leave your home after dark on Friday the 13th. Most had long forgotten the origins of the tale, dismissing it as an old wives' warning. But for some, the fear still lingered, like the mist that shrouded the town every year on this cursed day. On this particular Friday the 13th, the sky hung low with thick, brooding clouds. The sun had barely made an appearance all day, and by dusk, the town was already draped in the heavy darkness that seemed to arrive too soon. The air felt electric, and the silence, broken only by the occasional creak of a house or the rustle of wind through the trees, was suffocating. Nina Harper, a 22-year-old university student, had returned to Hollow Creek reluctantly. She had grown up hearing the stories but never believed them. She had outgrown the town's superstitions, especially after years of living in the city. To her, Friday the 13th was just another day. So when her car broke down on the highway just a few miles from town, she didn't think much of it. She left the car and started walking toward her old home, ignoring the ominous feeling that gnawed at her. As she walked along the road, the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch unnaturally long, reaching for her, as though they were alive. The deeper she went into the woods, the quieter it became. Even the wind seemed to die down. The only sound was the crunch of her boots on the gravel road, each step echoing louder than it should have. The air grew colder, biting at her skin, but what truly unnerved her was the sense that she was no longer alone. Nina stopped, glancing over her shoulder. Nothing. She shook her head and quickened her pace. Her phone had died, and there was no signal here anyway. The thought of being stranded in the woods at night on Friday the 13th started to feel less like a joke and more like a mistake. She finally reached the outskirts of Hollow Creek, but something felt wrong. The town looked deserted. No lights in the windows, no sounds of life. As she passed the familiar houses, she noticed they seemed different, older, decayed. It was as if they had been abandoned for years. A thick layer of dust and cobwebs covered the doorways. The trees, once lively, were now twisted and barren, their branches resembling skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. Nina's pace slowed as she approached her childhood home. It was just as she remembered it, yet eerily still. The front door creaked open as she approached, though she hadn't touched it. Inside, everything was covered in dust, the furniture draped in white sheets like forgotten ghosts. She called out, but her voice was swallowed by the silence. As she walked further into the house, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The air was thick, almost suffocating. Suddenly, the floor beneath her groaned, and the temperature dropped sharply. She froze, hearing something faint, a whisper, soft but unmistakable, coming from upstairs. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to follow the sound. The old staircase creaked with every step, each one feeling heavier than the last. As she reached the top, she saw a flickering light coming from her childhood bedroom. The door was ajar, just enough for her to see a faint glow. She pushed it open, the wood groaning as though in protest. Inside, the room looked untouched, except for a single candle burning in the center of the floor. Around it, strange symbols were drawn in what looked like ash. The air was colder here, and the whispering had grown louder, though she still couldn't make out the words. And then she saw it. In the corner of the room, standing in the shadows, was a figure. At first, it was barely visible, just a dark silhouette. But as Nina's eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer. It was a woman, pale, her long black hair hanging in tangled strands over her face. Her eyes, when they met Nina's, were hollow, as if the life had been sucked out of her long ago. Nina's breath caught in her throat. She tried to move, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. The figure took a step toward her, and Nina's body tensed. Her mind screamed at her to run, but she was frozen in place, trapped by the figure's gaze. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. The figure stood still, just inches away from Nina now, her cold breath brushing against Nina's skin. In the silence, a single word escaped the figure's cracked lips.
Run.
Nina broke free from her paralysis and bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping as she flew out the front door. The town was still empty, but the shadows seemed to move now, swirling around her as if they were alive. The whispering returned, louder this time, surrounding her as she ran. She didn't stop until she was out of the woods, back on the highway. Her chest heaved, her mind reeling. When she looked back, Hollow Creek was gone. Not just the figure or the shadows, the entire town. It had vanished, as though it had never existed. But as Nina stood there, gasping for breath, she realized the curse of Hollow Creek wasn't just a story. Friday the 13th had claimed another victim, and this time, it had taken the whole town with it. And in the distance, carried on the wind, she heard the whispers again. It wasn't over. It was a chilly Friday the 13th, and the town of Willow Creek was eerily quiet. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, obscuring the roads and swallowing sound, leaving an oppressive silence that settled into every crack and crevice. Jenna, a college student home for the weekend, drove cautiously through the deserted streets, heading back from a late-night study session at her friend's house. The stories about the town's curse on Friday the 13th were all anyone had talked about that week, but Jenna didn't believe in ghost stories. At least, not until that night. As she rounded the bend towards her house, the headlights of her car flickered briefly before cutting out altogether. Jenna's heart raced, and she cursed under her breath, pulling over to the side of the road. She fumbled with her phone to call for help, but the screen stayed black. No signal. Typical, she thought. The fog seemed to thicken, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Suddenly, a soft tapping echoed from the passenger window. Jenna froze. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as her breath caught in her throat. There was no one around. Not a soul had passed her since she'd left her friend's house. She hesitated, then slowly turned her head towards the window. There was nothing but swirling mist. She let out a shaky breath, her rational mind taking over. It's just the wind, she told herself. Still, a sense of unease gnawed at her, and she decided to step out of the car to check the engine. The night was still, almost too still, as if the world was holding its breath. The air was cold and damp as she opened the hood, pretending to know what she was looking for. Out of the corner of her eye, Jenna caught a glimpse of movement in the trees lining the road. Her head snapped up, and she squinted into the darkness. Nothing. But the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The tapping came again, this time louder. Jenna's pulse quickened, and she slowly walked back to the car, the fog coiling around her legs like tendrils. As she reached for the door handle, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind her. She whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest. A figure stood in the fog, just barely visible, watching her. Tall, unnaturally still, its face obscured by shadow. Jenna's breath came in shallow gasps. She threw herself into the car and slammed the door, locking it with trembling fingers. The figure didn't move but seemed to be waiting, lingering on the edge of the fog. Desperately, she tried to start the car again. The engine sputtered and died. The figure stepped forward. Jenna screamed, hitting the horn in a desperate attempt to scare it away. But the sound was swallowed by the fog, dull and muffled. The figure was closer now, its features still hidden, but its presence loomed, heavy and suffocating. Just as Jenna reached for the door again, the figure stopped. Its head tilted, as if listening to something Jenna couldn't hear. And then, without warning, it dissolved into the mist, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The car engine roared to life. Jenna didn't wait to question her luck. She sped off down the road, her heart pounding, refusing to look back. She kept telling herself it was her imagination, that there was nothing in the fog but her own fear. But deep down she knew. Some things are better left unseen. As she pulled into her driveway, Jenna noticed something strange on her passenger seat, a single black feather, wet with mist. That night, Willow Creek's curse was no longer just a story. Jason Matthews never believed in ghost stories. Hollow Creek was no different. Every year on Friday the 13th, the locals would spin tales about the cursed creek that ran through the old village ruins. They'd say the water ran black, whispering voices called out from the woods, and anyone foolish enough to get close might vanish, just like the 13 children long ago. But Jason? He scoffed at it all. Superstitions for bored people, he'd tell his friends, always shaking his head when they warned him about going too far into the woods on this cursed night. So on a dare, Jason found himself standing at the edge of Hollow Creek as the clock struck midnight. The full moon hung overhead, casting a silver sheen over the water, but to Jason's surprise, the creek didn't seem eerie, just still. Almost unnaturally so. The usual sound of running water was absent, and an odd silence blanketed the woods. He crouched by the bank, smirking to himself, and dipped his hand into the creek. It was ice cold, more frigid than it should have been for a late September night, and when he pulled his hand back, it was stained black, like ink. His stomach churned, but he shook it off. "Just muck from the creek bed," he muttered. Then came the whisper, faint like the wind through the trees.
"Jason."
He froze, his pulse quickening. No one knew he was here. His friends had refused to join him, staying safe in the warmth of their homes, too scared to face the legendary creek. But the whisper had sounded close, too close.
"Jason."
His breath hitched, and against every instinct, he called out, "Who's there?" Silence. He told himself it was a trick of the mind, the dark playing games. But when he turned to leave, the whisper returned, louder, closer.
"Jason, come closer."
Against his will, his feet moved. He edged toward the creek, his eyes drawn to the water. It no longer reflected the moon but swirled black, rippling though no wind touched it. As he watched, a shape began to form beneath the surface, a pale face with hollow eyes, its mouth twisted in a silent scream. Jason staggered back, but the water reached for him. Black tendrils of liquid shot out from the creek, wrapping around his legs and pulling him forward. He tried to scream, but the voice, his name, over and over, filled his mind, drowning out his thoughts. The cold seeped into his bones, numbing him as the water crept higher. Desperately, he clawed at the ground, but it was too late. The water was up to his chest now, cold hands pulling him deeper. As his head went under, the last thing he saw was the twisted, hollow-eyed face staring back at him, its lips forming one final word.
"Stay."
Then, the world went dark. The next morning, when the sun rose over Hollow Creek, there was no sign of Jason. His friends searched, the police were called, but they found nothing, just a shoe near the water's edge and the faint imprint of hands in the mud. The villagers nodded knowingly. "Another one lost to the creek," they whispered, adding Jason's name to the long list of those who had vanished. The whispers in the woods had claimed another soul. Now, every Friday the 13th, the legend grows darker, and the tale of Jason Matthews, the boy who didn't believe, serves as a warning: Hollow Creek is not a myth. And those who don't believe always find out. Too late.